Well, it is my great pleasure to be here today with Dr. Madeleine Chalmers, who's a lecturer in French Studies at the University of Leicester, and who most pertinently for this uh, interview has written a wonderful new book that's coming out in the Edinburgh University Press Crosscurrents series that I have the joy and privilege of editing. I think the publication date is around December 2024. And the book is French
That's right.
Technological Thought and the Non-Human Turn. Very intriguing title. So welcome, Madeleine.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you for inviting me.
Not at all. I'm really looking forward to this. I had such a ball reading the book, as I have the privilege of doing as editor. So many things to ask you. I wonder if before we could get into the nitty-gritty of the book, I could just invite you to sort of tell the story of what led you to write this book. What's the backstory behind French technological thought and the non-human turn?
Well, the backstory starts with me in my undergraduate years, stuck in bed with the flu, watching Blade Runner while running a high fever. And that was it. I was sort of transfixed by this film, and it was just around the time that conversations were starting to happen about the development of AI. And that was sort of starting to permeate mainstream media discourse. And I made the connection and sort of started thinking for my undergraduate dissertation, maybe I can do something with technology. Came across this 19th century novel where the term android was invented, made it into the book many years later, and that was it. I was off on that track, and it's kept me occupied and busy and thinking ever since.
Well, you're probably the one person in the UK who's thrilled to have had the flu.
Indeed, you just never know what's going to set you
That's
off on
right.
these research
Yes.
journeys.
Catch a cold, write a book. Um, I,
Exactly.
I I think it'd be helpful for people watching and listening to get a sense of where the argument of the book sort of situates itself in the landscape
Mhm.
of different discussions going on. So I wonder if you could just sketch for us what are the primary debates that the book intervenes in, particularly,
Mhm.
the intersection of technology and theology and the non-human turn, all of which you're conjuring with in the book, and the reason why it fits so wonderfully in the cross-currents, cross-disciplinary series as well. And so how are you aiming to challenge or to reconfigure the current scholarly conversation with this book?
Yeah, I mean it's a great question. So I mean if I start with the non-human turn, which is that kind of cluster of theories and approaches that are sort of seeking to decenter the human, to show us entangled with our environments, with other non-human agents, whether those be animals or minerals. And that's a sort of cluster of theories that I was working with as a postgraduate. And I sort of noticed that the non-human term was often constructed not in a positive sense as being about this, but in opposition, so constructed by what it isn't. And it was often constructed in opposition to a certain understanding of Christianity or a certain understanding of sort of the Western tradition of the metaphysics of presence. But coming at this as someone from a French studies background, all I could see was the Bergsonian vitalism, the sort of rhizomes of Deleuze and Guattari, and Latour's actants and networks. All I could see was that these were part of a much longer literary history, a much richer and weirder history that went all the way back through surrealism and into sort of late 19th century Catholic theology and mysticism. So it was coming from a literary perspective that enabled me to see those connections between this body of non-human theory that claims to be constructing itself in opposition to Christianity, and actually this sort of Catholic taproot that was sort of nourishing it in underground ways. And I wanted in this book to sort of dig into and start to tell that story.
It's such a productive way of doing it. I love the idea of just tracing an alternative genealogy as a way to really quite sort of gracefully subvert the way that people think about something. And as I was reading it, I found it incredibly compelling as well. Yes, it does seem that there is, this line that you can trace back. And lo and behold, you end up perhaps somewhat surprisingly in the midst of Catholic thought. Who would have thunk it?
Indeed.
One term that keeps coming back in the book, and I think it's a term that you've invented, correct me if I'm wrong, is
Yes.
technologos. Sort of trying to capture this relationship between technology and theology. Could you just sketch for us how this idea of technologos that you've developed differs from other frameworks, perhaps, Stephen Connor's technography, and the role that it's playing in your analysis?
Yeah, absolutely. So it is my own term. As far as I know, no one else has used it. And it is sort of very rooted in that late 19th century moment in French culture when there's a crisis of faith. But there's also, in artistic terms, a crisis in language. Sort of decadent movement in literature is sort of starting to experiment with breaking down words, with questioning the value of language and literature in a world that's beset by political crisis, a crisis of sort of identity, if you like. And that word logos captures that, of course, with its uppercase L, it refers to Christ, the person of Christ, the word of God. With its lowercase l, of course, logos, logic, rhetoric. And so that term kind of holds together those sort of twin kind of crises, if you like. We might think of sort of Nietzsche and God remaining in the grammar and so on. And there were lots of experimentations with the opening of John's Gospel. In the beginning was the word. In the late 19th century, it's a phrase that you see sort of played with and subverted and riffed on in sort of French literature at that time. In terms of sort of sticking techno on the front, that sort of speaks to the way in which the writers that I'm focusing on kind of sees on technology understood in a broad sense, not just as specific objects or things, but as the relationship that we have with those things and with the material world, as trying to find that as a sort of way into sort of the logos, to way into understanding being, whether that's in a Catholic sense. So I have some writers who are sort of trying to redeem technology, to redeem the material world for religion, and others who are sort of riffing on those religious forms in order to sort of imagine a sort of secular alternative. But this word technologos allows me to kind of bind together all of these different impulses, literary forms, resonances or motifs of crucifixion or of incarnation, and the way that they all get sort of blended together in this particular moment in French culture, and how that then travels through the 20th century and up to where we are now. So in terms of how that differs from, say, technography, which is Stephen Connor's term, so the wonderful work that he's done on how technologies get written and dreamt and imagined, I think the difference is in the suffix. Graphy is focusing on writing, and specifically writing being done by human beings. So it still sort of roots it in a sort of representational, human-driven sense. Everything sort of comes back to the human or as a reflection of human preoccupations. Whereas with the technologos, I'm showing writers who are writing, creating their own logos, but they're engaging with something beyond themselves, that wider logos, with a capital L, if you like. And for some of them, that is Christ, and for some of them, it's trying to find an alternative sort of mode of being or connection with the world, an alternative framework. So I think that's the sort of slight difference. With my writers, the technology is shaping them as much as they're writing it, if you like. So it's just a slightly broader understanding of the ways in which technology and writing can be entangled.
Yeah, no, absolutely. It's really fascinating what you were saying there about the way in which the beginning of the Johannine prologue is reworked in French thought in this period. In the beginning was, what are we going to put there? I wasn't aware of that reworking. I came at it through German literature, and Goethe's Faust has
Yes.
this very famous passage, am Anfang war, and then he ends up with die Tat, it was the deed. And he's again
Yes.
using that motif as a
Mm.
vehicle to rethink the priority of different sort of different human faculties. Um,
Yeah. And that moment in Goethe is actually picked up by some of my writers as
ah,
well, where they debate whether he had the right translation. Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. And there's also a really fascinating juxtaposition here, isn't there, between the a narrow sense of technology that we often consider to be ephemeral and of the moment and constantly changing, and this idea of the logos, which is, quintessentially Anfang, in the beginning. It is that which sort of precedes and makes sense of everything else. And I think that in itself is a really productive juxtaposition of ideas, bringing that logos idea into conversation with technology. So we've got this technologos. Another key term in the book is technics, and a particular understanding of technics that I think is will be familiar to people who study sort of recent French philosophy, but may not be that well understood outside it. So when we talk about techniques, we don't really just mean tools or machines, do we?
Mhm.
What do you mean by this word in the context of the book?
So I suppose what I understand by technics is that whole constellation of relationships that we have with the world that are sometimes mediated through tools. But what I wanted to get away from was this idea that technology means a computer or something made of metal or something plastic, which is often the kind of automatic association that's sort of made in sort of everyday sort of language usage. And I really wanted to show techniques as something that's dynamic and something in which humans, objects, entities, not all of them visible, forces, physical forces, are all sort of bound together, and in which the sort of affective dimension plays its part too. So when I'm thinking about techniques, I wanted to sort of move beyond that sense of there's someone who's acting on something else through the means of a thing, to think about just a kind of complex and sort of dense network of relations, and going for a term that is sort of capacious, I thought allows me to kind of hold together all of that mess and unruliness. Whereas if I, in my introduction, say I'm talking about technology, but I'm not talking about this or this, and I'm talking about this, but not that part, I felt actually narrowing down just ends up excluding things and setting up, talking myself into logical holes. So let's be capacious. Let's allow space for all these things. Let's not rule anything out before I've had a chance to sort of work through it. So that's sort of the motivation behind the use of that term. And that's sort of the motivation behind the cover image of the book as well. So in the very beginning, I open with a sort of reading of a sculpture by Rodin that is both, that for me kind of encapsulates techniques and technical processes. That's both the product of technical processes, but there's also showing them being enacted, but also reflecting on the circumstances of its own workings. And I hope that helps readers sort of find their way into what I'm driving at.
That's incredibly helpful. Thank you. Yeah, really helpful. Um, uh, Part of your title is the non-human turn, and people will usually understand that in terms of something like a decentering of the human. We want to move past anthropocentrism, um, and people would not usually reflexively say, Catholicism, that's what we need in order
Yeah.
to sort of actualize this non-human turn. So could you just help us to see how does the Catholic tradition, which as you very eloquently said in this conversation so far, is a sort of key genealogical moment in coming to
Mhm.
this technologos. How does that help to, I don't know, complicate or enrich this decentering of the human?
Mm. Well, I'm really glad you say Catholic tradition, because it's important to say that this book doesn't in any way sort of reflect sort of dogma. It isn't a work of theology or theological scholarship. It's about studying that kind of lived Catholicism and studying how these writers and thinkers are sort of processing and reworking it for their own sort of ends. But you're absolutely right. I mean, going all the way back to Galileo and the Inquisition and the debate around heliocentrism, there is that perception of Catholicism as fundamentally human-centric and authoritarian, which of course, in its most oppressive and abusive forms, it can be and has been. But I think what's often overlooked is the kind of immersion and care for the materiality of the world that's present in sort of what we might call everyday lived Catholicism. And people might think of sort of those slightly kitsch devotional objects, rosaries, statues, imagery. But of course, at an even more sort of fundamental level, sort of the Catholic understanding of sacramentality means that very basic substances, oil, water, fire, actually are not just symbols, but actually are a direct agent of sort of divine grace and transformation. So these very elemental things, very basic, ordinary, everyday things, become something else, something spiritual. So the material and the spiritual are in constant conversation. And of course, the culmination of that really is sort of the doctrine of transubstantiation. And that's kind of the element that I wanted to engage with, because it's one that I don't often see talked about. Um, and that's the element that I think these writers engage with, and that's sort of pertinent for technics. These are technologies of grace, if you like. Yeah, that's sort of what I wanted to explore, and why I think there's a rich theme in sort of the Catholic tradition for thinking this. And of course, Bruno Latour, who is a sort of big figure in sort of the non-human turn, has spoken about his own Catholicism and sort of gestured towards this kind of relation. And when we think about sort of the French philosophical tradition, Deleuze is taught by and supervised by academics who study Nicholas of Cusa, Duns Scotus. These are philosophers, but they are also monks and priests first. They're theologians. And that sort of sometimes seems to get separated out from their philosophy. And I just sort of wanted to try and reconnect those dots, if you like.
I'm beginning to piece together a picture of the book, and tell me if I'm on the right lines about this, as a book about relationships. So the logos is that which brings the disparate, fragmented, atomized sort of
Mm-hmm.
reality into relation. You're talking very persuasively there about the relationships between, the theological religious tradition and the more secular philosophical tradition. To what extent do you think this is a book that, if you had to sum it up, you could say it is a book about relationships?
I mean, I would say that's exactly it, and that's the thread that runs all the way through in kind of superficial ways. Some of my writers knew each other or referred to each other, but also in the kind of most fundamental sense, it is all about relationships, right to the sort of most fundamental level. As I say, relationships in between matter and spirit, between body and soul. So all the way up and down, I think it is a book about relationships and about the messiness of them, the undecidability of them sometimes, and just wanting, and perhaps I hope inviting readers to see those connections and see those unruly, messy relationships that often I think our kind of slight disciplinary enclosure prevents us from engaging with.
I'm all for that. You had me at unruly relationships. I think that is profoundly helpful in the current academic climate to be doing that sort of work. We mentioned a couple of very well-known French
Mm.
thinkers already in this conversation. I think Deleuze has come up twice. We've had
Yeah.
Bruno Latour, and that's fine, and we can have a conversation about those.
Yeah.
But I want to talk about some of the lesser-known figures
Yeah.
that you discuss in this book. Jean Richepin.
Mhm.
You've got Marcel Schwab in there. Um, could
Yeah.
you just sketch in for people listening or watching who may not be familiar with them, who are these people, and why have you found it helpful to incorporate their thinking
Mm.
into your study?
So these were actually my starting point, my original starting point when I talked about my feverish afternoon with Blade Runner. I was working on 19th century literature, and I started off saying, let's find like machines and robots in 19th century French literature. Like let me see whatever reference I could find. And so I ended up with these writers who are completely forgotten now, and completely forgotten within French studies as well. Jean Richepin, he was huge in his day back in the 1870s. He was, he had a long career, started off as a sort of renegade, and then, of course, became very establishment. So these are writers that they've sort of stayed in the margins or footnotes. Marcel Schwab's a bit better known, but mainly in 19th century French literary studies. That's been their home. That's where they've been discussed and contextualized as part of the decadent movement or part of the symbolist movement. But once I started working with theory and with French thought, I noticed these resonances. And originally, when I first sort of started thinking about the doctoral project that eventually became this book, I thought I'll put them in dialogue. I'll have old on one side and new on the other, and I'll see how they talk to each other. But as I sort of worked forwards from the old side and backwards from the new side, I realized that it wasn't a back and forth, it was actually the same conversation. And I was tracing the same names and the same motifs and the same books all the way through, right up to Deleuze. So those literary figures, those unknowns, were my starting point. And then I was able to see, wait, why is Deleuze talking about this very strange, forgotten short story in this collection of essays, and realizing it all links up? So they are unknowns. I hope they will not stay unknowns forever. But as I say, it's being able, sort of straddling that world of French literature and French thought, that kind of allowed me to see perhaps these connections. I don't know what things are like in Australia, but in UK academia within modern languages, there is very often a kind of divide between people who do theory and thought, and then people who do literature, and never the twain shall meet. And this project is really, I hope, kind of exploding that and saying there's so much that these two sides can say to each other. They are having the same conversation. We just need to put them in the same room.
Yeah, absolutely. It's another relationship right there.
Absolutely,
Um,
absolutely.
yeah, and it, it it wouldn't be an academic book if there wasn't a bit of critique going on as well. And one thing that you critique in the book, and to my mind, very validly and to very good effect, is what you call a reduction to signification in the non-human turn. I wonder if you could just explain what reduction to signification is, and then what you think is problematic about it.
Yeah, so this is that reduction to sort of certain binaries. So I mentioned earlier, of course, that the non-human turn, and this is some writers in some books, this is not a sort of blanket statement, but often say in opposition to, say, the Christian sense where we have the human subject and everything else is an object, or the matter spirit binary, the non-human turn proposes this entanglement, mesh, web, whatever network, whatever metaphor is being used. But what my issue is that that notion that the subject-object binary represents all of Christian thought is obviously reductionist and simplistic, but also I'm concerned that what is fundamentally a kind of intellectual shorthand, subject slash binary, matter slash spirit, is being taken as, as the idea, when of course it's a shorthand for a relationship, a tangle of negotiations, where we can be subject and object at the same time and constantly switching roles between them. And I suppose it's that kind of reduction that I wanted to get beyond, because yes, it's a kind of sometimes a polemical or rhetorical ploy, but I do worry that there's a risk then of us just sort of accepting this kind of shorthand, this sort of overdetermined rigidity, and accepting that as being, that is what Christian thinking about this is. And again, it closes off that conversation that can be had with the sorts of tradition that I'm engaging with in this book. So that's sort of my issue. And again, it's interesting, isn't it? It is about logos. It's about the way that sometimes these arguments are framed, but then the way that they're framed actually is then starting to determine and shape and limit the parameters of the argument itself.
Yeah, no, absolutely. That's an incredibly helpful intervention to make, and I'm really, really glad that the book does that. Coming to the conclusion of the book, and I suppose the conclusion of this conversation as well, you very sort of enticingly gesture in the conclusion to the idea that theories of the non-human turn in the tradition of technologos, as you're presenting it in the book, could open new perspectives for reading and working with this theoretical material. And I would love you to sort of follow through on that enticing moment with a little bit of sort of flesh on those bones, as it were. What new perspectives do you hope or expect either to follow, perhaps in your own work in the future, sort of off the back of the arguments of this book, or do you hope that others might want to pick up on?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think there is like a whole sort of second volume to be written in terms of unpicking certain non-human theorists and finding sort of genealogies and connections within them. I suppose there's a sort of very broad sort of argument that I'm making, and I've sort of already, I suppose, hinted towards it, which is I would like to see less of a sort of two cultures view of a philosophy and theology, or kind of thought and sort of religion, and less of a two cultures between literature and philosophy, where literature can be used to illustrate philosophical points, but we're not seeing literature as itself perhaps a vehicle for philosophical thought. And as I've mentioned, with philosophy and theology, sort of discussing thinkers without reference, of course, to their own theological training or theological awareness. So in sort of very broad terms, I hope that this book sort of shows how that can be done, and the benefits of a sort of slightly rangy, long, ambitious, capacious sort of history of an idea, if you like. More specifically, in terms of engaging with the non-human turn, what I hope that this sort of offers readers is perhaps a glimpse of how much richer non-human critiques could be, if rather than sort of engaging in this polemical, at times almost straw manning argument as a means of sort of rooting their positions, if we engage in that richer, more complex conversation, we could perhaps deliver richer, more convincing critiques, richer alternatives. We could look to the alternatives that have already sort of existed. But I think, again, it's about seeing that richness and complexity rather than cutting ourselves off and constantly needing to show ourselves as doing something new. Actually, if we look back at the old, at what we're still carrying with us, that conceptual baggage that is still bleeding through, perhaps if we engage with that rather than trying to suppress it or sort of banish it, excommunicate it, then it can open up new resources for thinking about our world.
And I think that readers who pick up this book will find that richness and complexity in spades,
That's
and
very kind.
will find a wonderful among many things in the book, a wonderful worked example of how to do that, how to have this richer, in some ways slower conversation, a conversation that doesn't jump to conclusions, that doesn't straw man, as you were suggesting a moment ago, and that I think is all the is allows itself to get all the deeper for that. And by forestalling those knee-jerk conclusions, really comes up with something very, very precious, very provocative in the end. So
Thank you.
congratulations on no, it's all it's more than merited. Congratulations. The book is French Technological Thought and the Non-Human Turn, coming out with Edinburgh University Press, December 2024. Madeleine Chalmers, thank you so much for your time.
Well, thank you for having me.